So we'll go ahead and get started. I think it was really organic the way these last few weeks have really kind of lined up. 4 weeks ago, we were talking about, or a few weeks ago, maybe it was towards the beginning. We were talking about equity versus equality, and then last week we had a great conversation about grace in school. But I think equity really came up in that conversation as well in a different way than what we talked about earlier in the web series. And so today we are going to be talking about equicentricity with Dr. Laura Hallberg and Dr. Louise Santiago. And so, um, ladies, I will ask you all to collectively introduce yourselves, but also as you're introducing yourself, if you could start us off by giving us a definition of what equicentricity is, because that is a new word that at first I didn't even know how to say it. I had to like stop and pause and sound it out, right? Go back to those kindergarten days when they say sound it out. But after reading the article, I'm fascinated with the concept of equicentricity. So as you're introducing yourself, maybe you can just give us a good understanding of what it is that we're going to be talking about today.
All right, Laura, why don't you start?
I knew you were going to do that.
To put you on the spot.
I know. Louise has a habit of doing this. So I'm Laura Hallberg. I am at the University of the Pacific in Benner College, where I am the assistant dean for our learning, leadership, and change programs, which include a doctoral program on our Sacramento campus, a master's program on our Sacramento campus, and then the program that I also lead called the Transformative Action in Education doctoral program, which is focused heavily on issues of equity, critical pedagogy, and transformative leadership. So I wear 3 different hats for Bennard at the moment. To give you my quick equicentricity definition, I wish you could see inside my head. I have this diagram that Louise drew on a Post-it note when we first started this conversation about what we wanted to do with in terms of our equity research. And it's really this cyclical idea that equity is always evolving, it is always moving, and at the heart of it, it is always coming back to self. And that you can't be an equity leader. You can't be a leader without equity being at the heart of it, and you can't be an effective equity leader unless you are constantly looking at yourself and your identity, and all the pieces that go into that, as you see in our beautiful diagram here.
Yeah.
I try to be LeBron and give you an assist there.
Good job, Ijoma. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Louise Santiago. I'm the director of the Graduate School of Education here at Thoreau University, California, and also the assistant dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences. And I have been, for the past several years, the program chair for the Educational Leadership Program at Thoreau, and that's where Laura and I, connected. And Laura actually taught, and we rewrote the curriculum for the just leading through diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think our shared background is, Laura as a Filipina and myself as a Latina, just kind of walking through the world with this lens of like, I don't understand why other people don't understand. I don't understand why this seems so hard for other folks. Because, living and leading with equity in the front, yes, it's hard, but it's required. And I just feel like that's really, especially today in 2020, that's what we're called to be. So a couple of years ago, we just sort of cobbled together this notion that we called equicentricity. It literally is equity-centered leadership. So we're being equity-centric, and then that's when we put together equicentricity. And so even our handle on Twitter is equa_centricity. Try to keep the separation between the 2 words, but see how they both go together. It's about equity centered thinking, being, living. And so in that model, maybe Ijoma, you could put it up one more time. I'll just just kind of walk people through it so they have just a cursory understanding. We're only going to really talk about the first step of it, but really it's just this sense that it's all embedded in self-care. You know, Audre Lorde in her, a lot of her writings really talks about, you know, self-care is really, you know, a revolutionary act. Like, it is the way that we can continue to work, to advocate, to work on behalf of others as well as ourselves. And if we don't have self-care, like, we can't hold up the whole system of equity-centered leadership. And so within that process, there are some really critical steps. Like, first, we have to be able to name our own identity. If we can't place ourselves within who we are and the context that we're situated in, then we haven't done like the basic work, because that naming is what leads us into a deeper self-awareness of how am I really transacting with others from this positional awareness of who I am, what my identity is about. And when we gather that self-awareness, we then also have to begin to take that backwards glance and recognize that looking at the past really has very much formed who we all are today. So taking that opportunity to really remember and bring forward those elements of the past that both help us identify who we are in this moment, but lead us into the awarenesses of how we are transacting in the world today. And as we begin to really integrate all of those understandings of self with others, self and how I'm situated in the past, and bringing that forward into the world today and going forward in the future, that there is a moment where as leader, we must make a definitive commitment, a stand in the world to say, I will be for change. I will be about change, so that, you know, equity really becomes the driver in that. Laura, you'd be interested, I was just chatting with some of our leaders this morning in the program, and, you know, they were just talking about how everybody's struggling with how do we help students right now, and now we have different equity gaps that are appearing, and so rather than like try to figure that out, they're experiencing their higher level leaders making decisions to say, well, then let's just do this for everybody, and they're all in the throes of going, but that's not equity. Right? Because we default to equality when we can't figure out the equity piece of it. And then that's so insufficient. And I know Ijeoma facilitated a fantastic conversation a few weeks ago. The recording is on our website, Diversity Now website, about equity and equality, and really trying to tease out that difference and recognize, you know, how we stay in that space. So thank you, Michael. He's got the link there for our article. We had written something, ASCD, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, had published just a small article that Laura and I had put together to really just explain this like 5-step process and how we can be situated in this frame, you know, as much as possible.
Thank you, ladies, for setting us up here with such an awesome definition. I will tell you, when I had an opportunity to read through the article, and then when I looked at the diagram, what stood out to me wasn't necessarily the 4 components, but it was the self-care that created it, right? And the reason why it stepped out to me is because, you know, one of the, you know, aha or mind-blowing moments from our webinar last week was when we talked about the importance of receiving grace, and not just about extending grace, right? And so the idea of self-care, and thinking about how identity and being bold about your identity is a process of self-care. That again was another kind of aha moment to me. And so I was hoping that you all could speak about that a little bit. Like, how does the name it fit into that self-care process?
Yeah, so that, let me start and throw a little thought out there, and then Laura, I'll toss it to you. You know, it takes me really to that first bubble, right, of naming it, because for me, it goes back to like my identity as a Latina. one of the things that has been challenging for me, and Laura and I actually are working on some new research just around imposter syndrome and how, you know, we show up as other. And really, it's not about we really aren't imposters. The fact is we are who we are, and other people don't know how to recognize that and accept that. And so then there's this redirect of, you need to be this way, you need to be that way. And so I've coached executive leaders for a long time. I have a strong career in that before I had shifted more into full-time working at the university. And so my own coach did a lot of work with me to help me, like, you know, claim my space and own who I am and talk about my achievements. And that is so counter to who I am as a human being. In the Latina community, especially in almost every culture, there's a phrase, right, that is how we respond to people. So on my mother's side of the family were from Mexico. My dad's side of the family were from Puerto Rico. My mom's best friend is from Nicaragua. Like, she has another friend from El Salvador. Like, everybody has their expressions. And so if my mother were to call my name, my response to her should always be mande. And mande translates into literally like command me, like tell me what it is you want me to do because I'm here, right? So my mom's best friend, Teodora, her response, being a Nicaragüense, her response is a la orden, right? Like literally, right? I'm here for you to order me around and be of service to you in whatever way I can. And so we have a literally mental construct that says, I am here to serve. And I'm not here to elevate myself, I'm here to elevate you. And so when I show up in the world not being that way, then the feedback that I get is, oh, I didn't know you were Hispanic. I didn't know you were Latina. Like, you don't seem like it, you know, because I was coached to be in this other construct, which is not a construct that's native to me. It's not organic to me. But in order to have some of the successes that I was able to have, it's like this persona, right, that I had to take on. And so that's my initial answer is like, like it just starts with the naming. Like, do you get who you are? And then do you get where the differences is of how you show up versus how other people show up and recognize that tension? And then how do you live through that tension? So I see Laura nodding. So let me stop there and kind of let Laura take it.
No, it just makes me think of sort of, I wrote an article about my first year in higher ed. I mean, I had 20 plus years in K-12 and moved into higher ed only 2 years ago and struggled a lot with being a Filipina in a higher ed space, because there are so few of us, right? There aren't, like, it's less than 2% of higher ed women are Filipina. So I'm alone. And I just remember a white male colleague saying, we're just on my first day, like, are you just going to sit there and not say anything? And I thought, I'm not supposed to, right? And coming to terms with what that means and what that means for my role, and tying that back to this idea of self-care is that like, I have to honor who I am and I have to be authentic. And if that means I'm not going to say anything in my very first faculty meeting in, you know, at a 4-year institution, then I'm not going to, and that's okay. You know, and I have learned that over the years, and you know, so many conversations with Louise's, you know, so what are you doing to take care of yourself? How are you pausing? How are you stopping to, like, process and you know, honor yourself before you move forward and do whatever's next on the to-do list, right? And those are the kinds of conversations she and I have and have always had. And so that sort of, again, as we were talking about equity and what we wanted to do and how this work was going to evolve, we literally stopped one time and went, wait a minute, we've totally forgotten about the self-care piece. We talk about it, we know it's important, we talk about it with our students and our colleagues, and it's not showing up in this research that we're doing, right? And we went back to our notes and we looked at the model and we went, okay, like, self-care really has to, like, hug the whole thing. It really is. And that's even why it looks the way it does graphically. Like, it has to wrap itself around everything that we do. And you know, like Louise is saying, it's not natural, you know, a lot of the time. I mean, even the term self-care, like, it came out of, like, you know, the mental health space back in the 50s, right? And then it became part of the civil rights movement. And I love, like Angela Davis calls it, radical self-care, right? In order to make any change, you have to take care of yourself first, right? That's how you move forward. And I remember that, and it seems even strange to call it radical self-care, because it's not really that radical. And yet, it's, particularly for women of color, to stop and say, like, no, I'm gonna take care of me first, then I got you. Like, that's weird. And yet it is so important, right? It is so important. And everybody always says, like, remember the instructions on the plane, like, put your own mask first, and then you put, the other. And we don't. We put on everybody else's mask first.
It's interesting that you say that we put on everybody else's mask first, because when I was reading about the Name It, and I began to reflect on my own past, I ended up at this place where I was just thinking, like I'm Black, and part of the Black experience for me has been, I want to say, an equity-centered experience, in that I've always been taught that the community comes before the individual. That if our family had something that our neighbor didn't have, that we would naturally try to bridge that gap by giving of ourselves, right? And so then, I kind of come to the model, and I think about, self-care, and like you said, like putting the mask on myself first. And part of me, like, there's a little bit of a disconnect there for me, as I'm so used to my identity as a Black person is always been to, like, give. And that is kind of my understanding of equity. But then we come back here and it's like, take care of self and then give.
Right.
And so
it feels selfish.
I don't know.
Right?
I guess I don't have a question out of that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah. What I appreciate,
selfish.
It does feel selfish, right? Because it's counter to how we're trained. I mean, I love Dr. Ken Hardy's work, right, where he says very clearly, like, he's got a beautiful graphic chart. And when he does his trainings, he's a psychologist by trade, but he does his trainings in the K-12 world, and he says, Black people, it's time to stop taking care of white people, right? Because there is a cultural message. We're raised in this way of, like, our job is to take care of other people. So feeling like we're going to take care of ourselves literally feels wrong. And generationally, why are you doing that? Like, elders will look back and say, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Like, that's not what you should do. And I want to actually loop that in. So Coach John put the question in the chat and said, how do you feel about the term minority? And I think to me, that connects to this conversation, because we're minority in that we have a country that was founded, because we all, in our K-12 studies, when we did our, undergraduate work, whatever, we all know about this thing called rugged individualism, right? And that's kind of this American construct of individualism. And so there's this notion that is the dominant thinking. And when you don't think that way, then you're in this minority because you don't think like everybody else. And I think what we know today to be true, or I believe to be true anyway, is that as this quote unquote minority of people who don't think that way are becoming the majority, then you have this push-pull tension. And for leaders who, superintendents, assistant superintendents, school principals, business owners, like all these leaders are in the middle of that tension going, oh, so how do I do, quote unquote, do equity? How can I be an equicentric leader? Because this messaging about individualism and this other thing about collectivism, which is what I think we bring to the table as people who don't come from that dominant narrative, really challenge that. And so what used to be what people would label as like a vocal minority is actually moving beyond that. So when we look at the numbers, we know in raw numbers, that sort of quote minority thing doesn't exist. In terms of the work that I do, similar to the work that Laura does, when we try to train up leaders, we're also looking at the fact that from a leadership perspective, that gets very, very white the higher you go, right, up the leadership ladder. And so we're trying to figure out and really feed and nurture a lot of people. That's why we have our diverse educator network here at Thoreau. Every fourth Thursday of the month, we have our call where it's just a working group of educators who are like, what else can we do to support more people of color coming into the education profession to really help students even see that, you know, you don't have to be white to be a teacher, because that's kind of been their experience. It's been their experience, not kind of. See, this is me. That's my Latina going, oh, be kind. You know, don't try to take a position and don't try to hold that position. And so soften it by saying kinda, right? So just recognizing again my own positionality in when I show up and how I show up even comes out in the words that I say. So really just trying to take that notion of minority. Well, who defined the majority? Not people like me. And so minority by whose definition, and how that's evolving and what that really means for us as a society. And really the lift that all of our leaders have now to really live from an equity-centered perspective, to always hold equity, not equality, out front. It's difficult because it is not how we were trained. It's not the narrative that we've all been raised in. And now we have to move in this direction.
And I'd also add, you know, to this question about how I feel about the term minority. To me, it implies that they're still on equal ground, they're still on equal footing. There's just not as many of them, right? Yeah. And so, like, to me, that's still an oppressive term. I tend to use the term marginalized because that's exactly what has happened, right? Like, oh, I'm not on equal footing. I don't hold the same space, just, you know, even though there's only 5 of me and there's 50 of you. And so, you know, minority just holds a whole other, like, really oppressive connotation, you know, that it's like, no, it still implies that I still have all the same rights and, you know, voice and all that, but I really don't. So.
We have a poll that I know you all wanted to include in our conversation. Mm-hmm. Did you want to include it now?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Go for it.
All right, I'm going to launch it if you all would like to explain it.
Yeah, go ahead and launch it. So just, yeah, when you think about your own work, right? How much of the time do you perceive that you are focused on equity issues?
And we're not, you know,
there's no right or wrong.
Yeah, we're not defining it. It's sort of like however you perceive that question to be, like, you know.
I feel like a kid because this is pretty cool.
new toys in Zoom webinar.
Yeah, I did not know Zoom was capable of doing this, man. I need to implement this in my actual class. This is nice.
All right, so 10 out of 11 people responded. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for doing that. So, so yeah, we just wanted to kind of have you think, you know, like we've talked a lot about equicentricity and we've talked a little bit about our experiences, but really, you know, where do you land on this? And just having this sense of where you feel like you're at in terms of how much of your time is focused on equity. That's just another important thing to take stock, right? And then let's go to the second question actually now, because I think from there we can launch into another piece of this conversation. So we got another question coming at you. And then from here, I think we'll be able to, if you want to put things in the chat after this question. So how often do you recognize the impact of your identity when issues of equity arise? So you have a sense of how much time you're spending focused on equity. When you have those issues of equity, how often are you recognizing your positionality, who you are, how that impacts the situation? Fantastic. Okay. So I'd love to hear, any comments in the chat about what that means to you. I think this is the piece of shifting from, the first stage of equicentricity model is that name it. Like first we have to recognize who we are. But the second stage is moving to that self-awareness, recognizing that, who we are, how we show up has some kind of impact on things. And I need to pay attention to that. So I recognize, for example, it's been more and more important for me to actually identify myself as Latina, because so many people are like, what? You're what? I didn't know that. And it's like, yes. And that's probably why we've disagreed on some things. That's why I have pushed for, a collective approach, a community approach, because for me as a Latina, I always tell people, like my parents, for example, my parents never go on vacation with any less than 30 people, right? So, if you're Latina and you're going to go somewhere and do anything, you're going to roll at least 30 deep or you're not going to roll at all, because what's the point, right? We just tend to be very community oriented all the time. So when I'm pulling for, but what about the community and how can we collectively impact, and others are pulling in a different direction, I can use my identity and explain how we are and why we are pulling apart in those conversations rather than pulling together. So that's just kind of my commentary on it. I don't know, Laura, if you have anything else you want to add.
Yeah, I was going to sort of say the same thing, and it is very cultural and like I said before, like it wasn't something I talked about much. It wasn't something I realized much. Right. And it wasn't until I said, like, yes, I am a Filipina, like that I understood sort of like where the connections were, how that was impacting my response to folks, the way that I was interacting with others. I got to ignore it a lot of the time and not understand it. And once I was like, oh, okay, this comes from, being a Filipina, that I was like, okay, now I see how much it influences the way that I respond or the way that I expect folks to respond to me and things like that. Right. It's both ways. And so that's why, like that, back to that, why naming it is so important. I didn't name it for a very long time. And so I was just going through the world like, this is how I'm supposed to be. This is how I'm supposed to be a leader, because this is what people told me it means to be a good leader. And then I was like, this makes no sense. Like, this doesn't feel right at all. And I'm failing miserably. And then when I was like, okay, I get it. I am a Filipina in this space and I am this and this and this. And then I was like, I can show up authentically. And now I feel like an authentic leader and don't feel like I fail, in the same way. And then back to that imposter syndrome. I don't feel like an imposter anymore because I own it. I own exactly who I am. And I'm not afraid to say, like, no, I'm not going to respond that way because I just don't. This is who I am. This is how I engage with folks. And that's important. It's important to be able to name that and say it and own it.
I think that's also a form of self-care. Going back to something, Ijeoma, you said earlier about, like, giving yourself grace. Like I remember, Laura, a conversation really early in your leadership career where, we were talking about, like, okay, so yeah, you're more quiet, right? That might be a Filipino trait. It might be something else. Maybe it's introversion. Maybe it's something else. Who knows? But how do you then own that and just say to people, I need a minute. I'm not going to respond right away, so that you give yourself permission to be who and how you are, so that they're not just sitting there thinking, why don't you ever say anything, right? Because in their mind, right, they have this definition of how you should be, quote unquote, should. Right. And like, who said? I have a really good friend I've had for decades, and he always says, I think he made the saying popular before other people ever picked it up, and he always says, it's not polite to should on people, right? So it's just, yeah, who says it should be that way? But we also have to figure out, how do we reclaim who we are and insert who we are in the conversation so that people can then respectively give us back some of the grace that we deserve, so that we can be more authentic and then come to the table with a richer, fuller level of participation, instead of participation under their conditions that might not, meet the mark for us or them.
I read this recently. Rachel Cargill, who an activist and author, and I always say, if you don't follow her on Instagram, like, do it. Like, she blows my mind every time she posts something. But she posted something that I wrote down. I was like, I have to have this, and I like, it's, in my journal, and she talks about showing up authentically writes permission slips for each other, right? And it tells others that we see you and we hear you, and that you aren't alone. And even saying that, even like repeating her words, like, gives me goosebumps, because I have fought so long and hard against showing up authentically, because I was trying so hard to fit what others said I should do and look like and say in order to be a good leader. And when I stopped that and I just allowed myself to be authentic, like, then all the good stuff started to happen, right? And things started to work the way that I envisioned them. And saying that it writes a permission slip for others, right? Like what better effective leader is it than to be a role model and allow others to feel authentic in your space with you, right? Mm-hmm. So I love that, right? And to say, like, you're not alone, and I see you and I hear you, because I'm showing up authentically. You please do so with me. And that's so important. That's so important for women of color to hear that, to say that, to feel that. And like I said, it's taken me so long. It's taken me so long to be like, this is who I am, take it or leave it. And it's made a huge difference in just how I show up as a leader, as a person.
I wanted to ask you all, this thought just kind of came up in my mind as you were talking, but what happens if you name it and you get to a place where you feel almost pressured to make an equicentric decision because you've named it, right? In other words, like, because I'm Black, I feel like I have to make what someone else may consider to be an equitable decision versus a decision that I may lean towards that may be more conservative or maybe more seen as less equitable, right? And I say that I would tell you why I'm asking this question, because I'm thinking about a lot of my interactions with Black educators and other educators of color as I was coming up as a youth. And I always remembered a lot of them were really hard and tough on me, right? They had a definition of equity that is a lot different from how we define it. And was almost kind of this notion of, because I've named it, right? Because I am Black, like you are Black, I'm going to be even harder on you, right? Like, I don't want to be seen as the person who is creating equity for those who are like me. I want to be seen as the person who is erasing equity, so that, when you make it, you've actually, made it. And I don't know if either of you have experienced that or have seen that, but what happens when naming it kind of, I don't want to say backfires, but backfires.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, immediately, sorry, Laura, jumping in here, because I'm immediately thinking, that's why you have to go to step 2. That's why it's a whole cycle, right? You can't just name it. That's not enough. Because that's just like saying, the house is painted blue, so that's what it is. No. Well, there's probably a story behind why the house is painted blue. You didn't just randomly pick that self-awareness and the reflection piece. That's where the power is, but that's where the pain is. Because as soon as you begin that reflection cycle about becoming more self-aware of how you've named yourself, you really are required to look right in the eye of that stuff that's right behind you that says, why are you being so hard on your own? Right? Aaron Tolliver, we had him on the very, very first session when we launched this whole series, and he struggled with that, because he was like, why is it, the flip side of that coin, he's like, why is it that people hired me and they're like, oh, you're the black guy, you're going to discipline all the black kids. He's like, and then my career is suddenly about just, suspending and my own kids. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, how did I get here? Like, this is a struggle, because there is this false, this other narrative about how you should be, about how you should show up, that a little bit of self-reflection might get you to that point where then you slip into, oh, let me remember the past and go, oh yeah. Because remember too, right? And I think we talked about on one of the previous sessions, especially in the Black community, right? Why have Black parents been so hard on their kids? Because if you didn't teach your kid to be quiet, to not be noticed, then you ran all the risk of having your kid plucked out of your, heart, literally sold off to somebody else. And so there was really an importance, a dire importance to be quiet, to be not noticed, right? And so there is that. When we remember the past, then we can kind of look at that and go, oh, that's why I'm feeling like I got to be so hard on my own, because there's a story behind this. Oh, then we go to step 4, right? Where it's like, how do I make a commitment? How do I really make a commitment to recognize it when I'm in the moment, to embrace it and go, yeah, that's my story. And then have a little bit more self-information and self-reflection, and then say, and so what decision am I pulling in the direction of now that I recognize and can see that for what it is? Laura, if that covered it, or
that kind of covered it. And for me, it goes back to again, like being authentic, right? And like there, for me, there is no other way, right? Like, I am who I am. I can't change my culture, my experience, my, anything, my identity. And so, sometimes like if I've been in a situation, I just have to say, well, that's me. That's my response. That's what I think. And I have to own it, because anything other than that is not authentic and is counter to every reason I'm here and every reason I'm doing this. Right. And it's uncomfortable, because I think it goes back to that, like, that I don't want anybody to be mad at me. I want to please, and I want to, and that's a very cultural thing. Like, just, okay, whatever, whatever I have to do to not make waves. But that doesn't work either, right? Like, so I just have kind of to go, well, you don't have to like it, but I've put it on the table.
And you don't have to explain it to anybody else either. It's your self-reflection. There's no mandate for you to share your story with everybody else, because their work is to do their self-reflection. Right. My work is to do my self-reflection. So really holding that space of like, yes, and this is where I'm landing. And that's
it.
Where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I like that idea of self-preservation, right? Like, part of the reason why we tend to navigate away from equity sometimes has been a product of self-preservation, right? It's been a product of an unjust system that we've had to live and survive in. And so, we're still operating under those old rules of survival, as opposed to operating under new rules of transformation, right? Where we force the system to bend to our will, as opposed to us bending to the system's will. And so I think that's pretty phenomenal, right? But like you said, that additional aspect of understanding the system and how we have survived versus how we're trying to transform, that comes in the next stages of self-awareness. And I like to call it, I call it Sankofa, right? The looking back to the past, because that was one of my favorite books when I first got to college.
Yeah, that was actually the very first conference that Laura and I rolled out our Equicentricity model. Was at a conference. Literally, the theme was Sankofa.
Yep.
So I had a question all lined up about the imposter syndrome, but you both have already touched on the imposter syndrome for me, so I don't have to do that. So let's where else do we want to take this conversation?
I'm just wondering if there might be any questions from folks. I also put the spelling of the word Sankofa in the chat in case anybody wants to Google it later and look it up. It's beautiful. Has a whole beautiful story behind it as well. So if folks want to drop something in the chat, and make sure, as Michael has put that great note, to make sure that you choose all panelists and attendees so that people can see your question, or you can use the Q&A feature to drop a question in there. So, I mean, just in terms of like the imposter syndrome, I'll say a quick word about the fact that, so Laura and I have been, working on this research. We have all this qualitative data that we've been collecting from leaders to really kind of reflect on, like, how have you named your identity, and what's the self-awareness that that's led you to, and how have you had to look back to your past and really try to reintegrate, and what commitments has that led to, and then how do you really manage self-care and practice self-care all throughout that. So we have this beautiful data set, and then the more we try to put that together and go, okay, so here, let's present this story and this narrative and have it unfold. We keep, the feedback that we get is, it's not scholarly enough, it's not this enough, it's not that enough. And we realize, wait a minute, but it so is, because it is about the narrative and is about the story. And, in qualitative data collection and qualitative research still is, to use that word minority, right? It's still not the most accepted method of research. I'm in a research group, and, one of the researchers in that group, we just come together for a writing space and really to work on our research. And one of the team members was like, there's just this sense of like the gold standard, and we all have to live up to this gold standard. And it's like, but who defined the gold standard, and who said it was the gold standard, and why does that have to still be the gold standard? And those are like the bigger questions to ask, is to, push back against that system, right? And as you were saying, Ijoma, like, how do you bend the system and shift it to something that's more normed around, everybody's needs, not just whatever that historical or dominant narrative might have been. So that's, thank you, Zarina. Props from Zarina, thank you.
And we went round and round. Like we have page and documents full of like journals that we could submit to, and conferences we could present at, and all of these peer-reviewed publications and things like that. And it sits in my gut like, ugh, like I don't want that. And and I say this to my students all the time who are doctoral students, like the only time you're going to use peer-reviewed journals is when you write your dissertation. Like nobody sits down with like journals and says, here's like nighttime reading for me. I mean, maybe some people do, but I certainly don't, and I don't know many people who do. And so like as we're talking through this, it's like, well, why are we still forcing ourselves? We're talking all this equity and identity, and yet we're still trying to force our researcher self into this box of being accepted by the academy to published in a peer-reviewed journal. And it's like, well, I don't really care. Like, I don't really care if I don't need their validation. I want to say what I want to say because I believe, like, why not? And I've said this to my students all the time. If not you, why not you? Right? Like, why not me? Why not Louise? And so then that started this new conversation about like, well, it's really not imposter syndrome. It's really rejecting what others say.
Owning our identity.
Yeah. In order to be accepted as a scholar, accepted in academia, this is the box you have to fit into. And I was like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah,
like, yeah. I'm good. I don't need that. Right. Like, I don't, that's not why Pacific hired me. It
right.
Really isn't.
And Belinda is sharing in the chat too, like, through her research, she's just finding that it is about constant reflection, and it is about self-care, because we think we need this at one time, and then that changes. And I think that's where we're at in the world, right? There is this dominant narrative of how you're supposed to be in higher ed. We didn't write that dominant narrative. We never subscribed to that dominant narrative, and yet we're measured by that dominant narrative, and it's not appropriate.
And I'm gonna give a little shout out to Belinda because I'm her dissertation chair. And she's one of the very first people that I ever said to when she was asking me about like her work. I said to her, why not you? Right? Like, don't deny who you are. Why not? Like, if not you, like, let it be you. And yeah, and I stand by that. Like, I don't need somebody else to say you're good enough. I know I am. Right? Like, I wouldn't have survived 25 years in this career if I weren't. So now I'm not going to force myself into some other box so that some stranger is going to say like, you're good enough, Laura.
But for some of our kids in the classroom, right, that's kind of where they're at. They're waiting for their teacher to kind of give them that seal of approval that's based on their measure of, and kids are interpreting that as a measure of their worth or intelligence when it's not. It's not the right measure.
It's interesting you both say that, because I was just having a discussion the other day about that term that was used when it came to how we constructed our reservation schools, right? The kill the Indian, save the man, right? And how that tradition has been passed down in our classrooms for the last 100+ years, to the point where, you know, we almost take that job upon ourselves, right? Like, I'm going to kill that part of me so that I can be rewarded, and so that I can, you know, show off to my teacher and have my teacher actually, you know, be proud of how much deculturalization I've taken on myself, right? and didn't make her or him do the hard work. And so now to get to this place where, you know, we are now beginning to reject that and say, no, like, actually, it is that part of me. It is the culture that I bring that makes me so unique, but also makes me so brilliant, right? It's why I know some of the things that I know, and I understand some of the things that I understand. And to get to that place is really an amazing thing, because then you start seeing it in every aspect of your life, right? It begins to extend beyond just our work as educators. And, you know, now all of a sudden I'm walking in the grocery store and I'm feeling I'm feeling real good about myself. Now I can pick up some watermelon and be happy. Like, yeah, I got the watermelon, you know.
Yeah, Robert, you know, Robert in the chat, he's like, yeah, I call myself a hybrid, and proudly, yeah, because I'm a little of this and a little of that, and, you know, I'm not what you want me to be. I'm not, you know, which actually goes right into Belinda's comment about, you know, how we see this generationally, because, you know, I think for some of us, like, we've shifted and said we've got to be different, and yet there's plenty of folks that are like, oh no, don't be different, and then there are plenty of other folks in the other end of the spectrum saying, oh no, I'm Americanized, and so therefore, and that's, you know, I mean, in my own family that's been a struggle, right? So you know, my dad would always have what we called white man's English when he would talk on the phone with his boss. And, you know, like, suddenly the accent was gone. He was a totally different man. We're like, who is this guy, right? But it's because that's how he had to be. And by the same token, we weren't allowed to learn Spanish because we had to practice English in the house, because my dad had to be masterful at English in order to be employed, right? This was in, you know, the 1960s. And so I learned Spanish when I went to high school and then went to college and kept studying it. So after 7 years of study, you know, then I'm, you know, somewhat fluent, although there's still a whole bunch of words that I don't know, don't have mastery of. I could still carry on a conversation. I can move around from country to country, but, you know, so there is a generational difference in terms of our sense of self-awareness and understanding of our history, and determining how that's going to reflect in how we show up, and making that decision, that commitment to change, right? How we show up in the world. That for some people, that's just not part of the equation. And for others, that is the equation, right? It is about showing up differently, so that you, as you say, you could proudly go to the grocery store and buy your watermelon, because, like, it's like, yeah, heck yeah, like, this is who I am. Thank you very much. right? So yeah, I mean, all of these are really difficult issues because, I mean, going back even to Belinda's earlier comment, because it is about self-reflexivity. It is just about constantly understanding and evolving your understanding of yourself so that you can be more authentic, you know, to use Laura's terms, right? So, yeah, it's a process. And I wonder too that I'm not sure that it's even generational. I think it has so many other dimensions beyond that. Gender is certainly a dimension of that, right? Yeah. Anyway, I won't get too far down the path.
I'm putting the link to your article in the chat. I want to encourage folks to, when you get opportunity, please go take a look at the article. Please go look at the different steps that it takes to become equicentric. And please, you know, begin to implement this in your daily practice as, you know, both an educator, but as just an individual. Real quick before we end, I know that naming it is the first step, but what is one easy exercise that one can do to start naming it? Like, what is something that, like, I can leave this conversation today and say, if I do this, that's the first step of naming it?
That's like our workshop. You want to tell us the first activity, Laura?
And it's super simple. I mean, you simply like start to like write down the words that you use to identify yourself. And it's the first exercise that I use. I teach a sociocultural perspectives course. I teach a class on leading in diverse organizations. And the very first thing that I do every single time is, all right, just write down the words that you use that you use for your identity. That's it. And I mean, it seems really simplistic, and yet it's not, because it does start to kind of unpack some of like our default, right? Like, you know, woman, teacher, right? Like and then it's like, no, keep going, right? And we encourage you to keep going just to start to see what those are. Because I think like, I kind of like, once they're on paper, once they're out in the universe, like you have to acknowledge them. And I mean, if you just stop with like woman and teacher, like, wow, like there's a whole lot behind there that you're not acknowledging, that you're not allowing yourself to acknowledge. And so that's really the first step, is just, you know, what are those words? What are those terms? And think about how they show up for you. Like, what does that mean when you say I'm a Filipina, right? You know, there's a lot to that.
Right. Again, taking you into that self-reflection, and you know, a lot of times the secondary activity we'll do then to get us into that second phase is to say, so describe a situation when the last time that you were aware of those labels that you give yourself. Describe a situation when you were aware of those within the situation as it was transacting. I mean, just that alone, when you begin to say something out into the universe, basically, or write it down on paper, it makes it real. So it's not just thinking about your identity, it's really stating, owning, you know, claiming your identity. But once you claim it, then you start to see yourself in that way and go, oh, look, oh, I'm in this situation right now. And I recognize that I'm actually being this way because of my identity. That's like the very first stages of self-awareness. The first stages are all about naming and getting to a level of reflection so that you can begin to see it. Because until we can see, literally with our own eyes, see ourselves in the moment, it's much harder to then say, oh, how am I making an equity-centered decision? How am I showing up as leader? Because you don't even know how you're showing up, first of all, based on your own authentic identity. So how do you do that? How do you do how do you jump ahead to the end of it without doing the preliminary work, Laura?
And it's not easy, right? Like, and it's harder than it sounds, right? And, you know, I was talking earlier about like understanding my place as a Filipina in higher ed, right? And my rejection of, you know, be what I thought it meant to be a Filipina. Like I just wanted to distance myself from that. And I just said that, like, until I accepted myself as a Filipina, like I had no clue how it showed up in my work. Right. And so it isn't just like, I'm a Filipina. Right. Right. Like how, like, what does that mean for the work that I do? Right. What does this mean for my culture, my heritage, my family, and all those things, and myself? Like, what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
So it once I understood that, once I claimed that, like, it really changed everything, you know, and the way that I do my work and the way that I do show up. So it's not just like, I'm going to write this word down and like close the book and I'm good. Like I'm equicentric now, right? Like I got this, right? But having that and seeing it and owning it and saying, all right, like now what do I do with it?
I love Coach John's comment in the chat about, you know, education. It comes from that root word, the Latin. Of course, I don't know how to pronounce it in Latin because I didn't study that in school, but I think it's like educe or something like that. But anyway, it just means educate really comes from the root word, means to bring something forth that's already inside of you.
Right. Yeah.
And so, yeah, our history, our culture, our heritage, it's already inside of us, but we do need to do the work of bringing it out, bringing it forth, naming it, so then we can see it, so then we can really operate from that strong basis that really created us as who we are.
And honoring it and valuing it and saying this isn't a deficit, this is an asset, right?
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really amazing conversation. I think it rolls right into next week when we start talking about gender and the mask, and you know, what mask are we carrying around with us every single day? And so I really appreciate this week we name it. Next week we take off the mask and reveal it, and go from there. So I am sad to see that this series is drawing towards its conclusion. After we have gender and the mask, we have one more that's at least on the website where we're going to be talking to our Latina educational leaders. And so these 9 weeks have gone by quick, but the Diversity Now series is not going anywhere. The topics may be running out for this part of it, right? But we're going to come up with a whole bunch of new topics and keep it going, because I really have enjoyed these conversations and enjoyed the interactions that we've had. Dr. Santiago, Dr. Laura, we appreciate you all for joining us today and really giving us some new information. I will be using this in my everyday language. I can't wait to use it on some of my friends, and they already think I'm smart, but this is gonna really blow their minds. I'm gonna be like, well, you know, I'm equicentric. I gotta work on it so I can say it fast. You know,
I do too. That's all right, Joe. I got to work on it too.
And then they're gonna be like, man, Doc, you super smart. I'll be like, you know.
Maybe we shorten and just call it like EC or something, like, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that.
Tagline.
Eccentric.
EC.
I love it. But no, thank you all, and thank you to all of our attendees today. And hopefully we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.